From the time of the church's beginning, believers down through the centuries have offered many defenses of the central tenet of Christian apologetics, the historicity of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. It is not surprising, therefore, to find knowledgeable Muslim efforts that attempt to counter this essential message, usually by offering more general responses to these Christian approaches. In this essay, I will address what are perhaps the two most common sorts of Muslim critiques of the resurrection. Perhaps most frequently, the rather immediate response is to point out many perceived contradictions, conundrums, inconsistencies, and copyist errors, both in the New Testament records themselves, as well as in the almost 6,000 existing Greek manuscripts. These objections are directed towards the New Testament text itself, in addition to differences in the myriad manuscript copies, or even to problems with what Christians hold to be the best and most commonly utilized of the contemporary translations. The second path taken habitually by Muslim apologists is to address directly the historical center of the Christian gospel claim, both that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion and that he was raised from the dead and appeared in a bodily manner just a short time later. Though we will make an effort to keep these two responses at least somewhat separate, these paths often coalesce for Muslims into a very similar or even the same point. Besides citing the Quran itself, the New Testament's apparent inconsistencies may be seen as perhaps the most common avenue to invalidating the Christian gospel claims. We will respond to each of these critiques in as much detail as possible in a single essay, though we of necessity will have to be satisfied with hints or suggested outlines due to the large volume of information here. Now, a lot of you know that when I argue for the resurrection, I always use what I call the minimal effects argument. I'm not going to go into any kind of detail here, but I'd like to read one paragraph of definition of this argument because it'll come up later in the paper. Each event had to be established. This is how the minimal effects argument works. Each event had to be established by more than adequate scholarly evidence, and usually by several critically ascertained independent lines of argumentation. Additionally, the vast majority of contemporary scholars in relevant fields had to acknowledge the historicity of the occurrence, these other facts. Of the two criteria, I've always held that the first one is by far the most crucial, especially since this initial requirement is the one that actually establishes the historicity of the event. Besides, the acclamation of scholarly opinion may be mistaken, or it could change. All right, so I'm suggesting the use of a method that says, on a thesis that says the Bible is the Word of God, the view I hold, and is inspired, we have a resurrection. But critics who think they can get out of it by saying, no, I think there's problems in the text and everything else, I'm saying if they're scholars, not just somebody shooting from the hip, but if they're scholars, they're going to concede a body of data, and they've still got a resurrection to deal with. So either way, they've got issues. All right, contradictions and discrepancies in the New Testament accounts? Question mark. When responding to questions, perhaps even the strongest and most common tradition within Islamic apologetics is to discount the New Testament writings by pointing out what are considered to be highly corrupted textual copies as they were duplicated down through the ages. We are not referring so much here to the factual or other claims made by the individual authors themselves, the New Testament authors, but more commonly to the many acknowledged variant readings that have accumulated through the years during the copying process. It has often been pointed out that the nature of this initial Muslim claim often sounds very odd indeed, especially to those who are acquainted with the actual particulars. Christians have acknowledged freely for over 200 years that there are many alternative readings in the New Testament. For example, Norman Geisler and William Nix, in their standard textbook on this general subject, published by conservative Moody Press, addressed this subject almost 50 years ago. These authors reported, almost without comment, that of the more than 5,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts that have been discovered up until that time, there were more than 200,000 variant readings in existence 50 years ago. The authors added the comment that, quote, this figure will no doubt increase in the future as more manuscripts are discovered, end quote. Their prediction, of course, proved to be the case, as the number of newly discovered Greek manuscripts has grown to almost 6,000, with the number of variants being placed presently at some 200,000 to 300,000. And by the way, that citation, 200,000 to 300,000, is a reference to none other than Bart Ehrman in his New Testament introduction. Some scholars have estimated an even higher number of variant readings in the copies. The point to be made clearly here is not only that the Muslim charges are largely already acknowledged by Christian scholars, at least in principle, but further, these variant numbers do not trouble these scholars at all, do not trouble Christian scholars at all, due to these same variations paradoxically being among the best indicators that allow the text to be reconstructed to a high degree. This general textual accuracy is even recognized by non-Christian scholars like Bart Ehrman, as well as under other skeptical New Testament specialists. And here I cite Bart Ehrman, Helmut Kirster of Harvard, and John A.T. Robinson in his little book, Can We Trust the New Testament? But there are other aspects to these Muslim responses as well. The objections often indicate an almost complete misunderstanding of the subject altogether, even to an embarrassing degree, and in areas that have nothing to do with the truth of Christianity. One of the best examples of this tendency is manifest repeatedly in the writings of Ahmed Deedat, especially since he has more or less become the specific influential pattern for other Muslim apologists. For instance, in discussing what he terms, quote, the extravagant and conflicting claims of the Jews and the Christians, end quote, an initial example provided by Deedat in his self-incriminating charge, he charges that the New International Version, quote, unceremoniously expunged, end quote, the according to on the title of each of the Gospels. Apparently viewing this as a problem, indicating that Christians changed their text almost on a whim. Yet he seems to be unaware that these words, as well as each of the four authors' names, did not at all originally appear or circulate in any of the original Gospels. So how could it be that any kind of a problem whatsoever? Who or what is this criticism aimed at? Another instance of severe confusion is provided by Deedat when he states assuredly that, quote, the Gospels, any Christian author will confirm, were first penned decades and centuries after Jesus. Close quote. Actually, not a single Christian scholar, liberal or conservative, will date the first writing of the Gospels to centuries after Jesus. There's an absolutely huge difference between the Gospels being written decades and the Gospels being written centuries after Jesus. At best, even if someone were inclined to allow that Deedat is simply confused here, thinking that this is an accurate statement, in factual terms, it is totally mistaken. So what is the issue here? Could it possibly be the case that he apparently thinks that the figure of 5,000 extant New Testament manuscripts represents original texts, as he calls them? He calls the 5,000 original texts. He seems to miss that the later texts are only copies of the originals. But these examples are not the only embarrassing claims. In another book, Deedat charges that the early church, with choosing just the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, quote, out of over 4,000 differing manuscripts the Christians boast about. Why did you only choose four out of the 4,000 copies we have? Not even sure how to respond. It's like, if I knew what you were asking, I might be able to help. Christians choose these four because these volumes supported, quote, their prejudices, according to Deedat. Once again, like the previous problem above, Deedat is not only confusing the manuscript copies of these four texts, but including copies of other New Testament books in this total as well. The 4,000 copies are not just copies of the Gospels, writings that are already found in the New Testament canon. Lastly, Deedat appears to think that new translations that differentiate from the King James Version are actually evidence of Christians' continual corruption of the original writings. Here's a couple of Deedat's charges that he thinks follow from this point. When different translations change words like virgin in Isaiah 7:14 to young woman, and begotten son in John 3:16 becomes only son, these betray textual corruptions, he says. But as Norm Geisler and Abdul Salih point out, the Hebrew and Greek terms have not changed one bit, so nothing has been corrupted. These are simply translational choices in English for these foreign words. Blatant confusions like these only serve to indicate that DDOT is unaware of the Christian claims and nuances in the first place. Repeated charges that confuse original works with their copies, and the same copies with new texts hardly hit the mark. They are simply illegitimate critiques altogether. There's also the claim that the authors of the original writings themselves, or later Christians, often contradicted themselves or each other, with several specific examples being given. He also gives examples of what he thinks are New Testament problems with the actual New Testament text. This is the more widely known charge, often heard in quote-unquote liberal theological circles, that the Gospels present contradictory statements. Many substantial and detailed responses have been made to these charges on a case-by-case basis, and we are, of course, unable to duplicate these efforts in the space allotted here. But examples are easy enough to locate, even specifically directed to the Gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection appearances. So I provide two lists here in the endnotes. One are books like Geisler and Howe and Gleason Archer that deal with Bible difficulties, and a second one that offer publications based on supposed contradictions in the crucifixion and resurrection accounts specifically. We will limit ourselves here to one specific example that can be treated more quickly. Nonetheless, far from a straw man case, this may be the single most common question of all with regard to the four gospel resurrection narratives. Namely, how many women discovered the empty tomb on the initial resurrection morning, and who were they? How many women, and what were their names? In Matthew's narrative, Mary Magdalene and another Mary made the walk to the tomb in Matthew 28. Mark names two Marys plus Salome, Mark 16. Luke mentions two Marys and adds Joanna in Luke 24, while John names only Mary Magdalene in John 20. Even leaving the list of names just like this by no means proves the existence of a contradiction. I mean, the four texts aren't 1, 3, 13, and 7. It's varying between 1 and 3 names. But further, each gospel contains additional caveats which clearly indicate that it was not the author's intention to be exhaustive in naming each of the women in attendance. In other words, if all four gospels tell you I'm not trying to be exhaustive, then we probably should not charge them with not giving us a complete list. I mean, that's just not fair. First rule of literary criticism, don't blame your text with doing something I already told you it wasn't going to do. Okay, for instance, when Luke gets around to identifying the women, he doesn't do it in 24:1 when the women first come to the tomb. He doesn't identify them for 10 verses later, 24:2. When Luke gets around to identifying the women, beyond the 3 names, he plainly states, quote, and the others with them, end quote, without naming any more. How much more clear could Luke be to say, here's 3 and there are others, I'm only going to tell you 3. Mark alone includes Salome, along with the 2 Marys, but while naming the same 3 women just several verses earlier during the burial account, remember there's no chapter dividings in the original text, just a few verses earlier, during the burial account, he specifically states that there were several other women as well, Mark 15:41. Similar to Mark, Matthew also names the women at the burial, just a few verses earlier, and includes a 3rd one, the unnamed mother of Zebedee's sons, James and John. So he just says James and John's mother, without giving her name, which means it's not my intent to give you a name. True, John mentions only Mary Magdalene by name, but when she goes to tell the disciples, she states that, quote, we do not know where Jesus' body was located. Why would she speak in the plural if she was the only one present? I mean, even Raymond Brown in his commentary say, well, good indication other people are present. That this may be the most commonly raised objection in the gospel burial and resurrection accounts is simply amazing. Each of the four writers either explicitly or implicitly acknowledges the presence of one or more additional unnamed women. Combined with the normal rule of literary criticism not to blame an author for something that they never intended to do in the first place, there's no conflict between the lists of women from one gospel account to the next. Over the last century or so, there have also been many sophisticated responses from more scholarly Muslim apologists than DDOT. For example, Malafi Saeed Amir Ali charged that Jesus never claimed to be deity in any way. Rather, he was a great prophet whose story was changed by the Christian gospel writers. Following an earlier point, he also contends that the crucifixion and resurrection accounts contain discrepancies. Another scholar, Maulid Muhammad Ali, indicated the gospel records were exaggerating their reports, including particularly Jesus' miracle claims, which is odd because the Quran says Jesus did miracles anyway. So, including particularly the miracle claims, which he regarded disdainfully as, quote, clearly pure inventions or exaggerations made to compensate for the apparent failure, unquote, of Jesus' message to change his contemporaries, in spite of the Quran's recognition that Jesus performed miracles and was a prophet. In a surprising admission, Salih ud-Din Quda Bukish freely acknowledges a number of problems in the Quran. He says there's problems with his book, such as Islam being an eclectic religion that borrowed freely from other religious traditions, including Christianity, as well as reported falsehoods, which sounds like, Dan, what some of the things you were talking about today. Nonetheless, Bukish still recounts Muhammad's rejecting the gospel accounts of the crucifixion, though still holding that Jesus was a prophet. He concludes his essay by calling for greater cooperation between Muslims and Christians. As we have said, these challenges by Muslim or other scholars can be answered on a case-by-case basis, usually with surprisingly minimal effort. Still, it is at these points that the minimal facts argument is also very helpful, as it calls for using only those facts that are freely recognized by critical scholars. Since these data admittedly meet the demands of historicity, the charges of discrepancies in disputed areas can be tabled until the force of the commonly held facts are entertained. After all, if these well-grounded details are sufficient in themselves to establish the crucifixion and even the resurrection as historical events, then disagreements in other areas are simply beside the point of whether these events themselves occurred. All right, I'm going to move to the death and resurrection of Jesus. At the outset, it should be noted that according to the teaching of the Quran and Islam as a whole, Jesus, or Isa, is a very important lofty figure, one of the most exalted of the Muslim prophets. Jesus is often included in a list of well-known Jewish prophets, surahs 2, 6, and 42. Jesus is also referred to as virgin born, surahs 3 and 19, and as the Jewish Messiah, surahs 3, 4, 5, 6. He was also sinless, surah 19, and performed miracles during his ministry, surahs 3 and 5. Of course, he's not believed to be the Son of God in any sense of deity, surahs 4, 5, and 19, and Allah alone is God, surahs 3, 4, 5, rather than a trinity of beings. Again, surahs 4, 5. When it comes to the crucifixion, Muslims almost always agree that Jesus did not die by crucifixion. However, several different options are chosen by various commentators as to what alternate route transpired instead of the depictions in the Christian Gospels. For example, Malavi Ali points out that the Orthodox Muslim position is that Jesus was, quote, saved by divine agency, that Jesus was translated to heaven, close quote. In his volume, Jesus in the Quran, well-known comparative religions expert Jeffrey Perrinder appears to agree, pointing out that, quote, traditional Islam has thought that Jesus was wrapped to heaven in a fleshly body though the Quran does not say so, end quote. According to Bukish, another popular view is one that he describes, ascribes to Muhammad's teaching that, quote, Judas was substituted for him and nailed to the cross, while the Christ himself ascended direct to heaven, close quote. A recent English translation and commentary on the Quran at Surah 4:157 comments, quote, it was Judas Iscariot who sought to betray Jesus, who was arrested instead and crucified instead of the prophet Jesus, upon whom be peace, end quote. A stranger view was favored by a major 14th century Muslim commentator, Ibn Kathir, who has Isa asking for a volunteer whom Allah would make to look exactly like him in exchange for sharing paradise with Isa. A young man volunteered, was changed into the image of Isa, and the young man was taken out and crucified. In the meantime, Isa was made to sleep, and in that condition ascended to heaven through a hole that appeared in the roof of the house where they were. D-Dot prefers to cite the Gospels except when he disagrees with them, so it is difficult to know precisely which option he holds. However, he is clear that whatever happened, Jesus definitely did not die by crucifixion. He may have been crucified, but he didn't die by crucifixion. Yet D-Dot seems to leave open the option as to whether Jesus was at least initially crucified without dying from this method of execution. He concludes his small book with the affirmation of the bottom line. He said, the one thing I'm sure of, I believe the Quran, Surah 4:157, that Jesus had not died by crucifixion, but only appeared that way. However, quite enigmatically, the very next verse in the Quran, 4:158, states that Allah took Jesus up to himself. Similar teachings are affirmed elsewhere. Allah is causing Jesus to ascend to him, 3:55. Jesus would die and be raised again, Surah 19:33 and 34. What do these intriguing texts indicate? Perrinder cites Muslim authority Badawi to point out that Muslim commentaries have differed on the interpretation of these latter texts concerning Jesus ascending or being taken up to heaven as well. Some Muslims even thought that Jesus was raised to heaven bodily, only to be sent back to earth 7 days after his ascension in order to commission his disciples, afterwards being taken up to heaven again. Perrinder comments further that the New Testament accounts of Jesus' ascension seem to be in view here. But he notes specifically that on the view that Jesus returned to earth 7 days later in order to send forth his disciples, as in the Gospels, quote, this is Perrinder, quote, the parallel is rather with the resurrection appearances of the Gospel. In other words, they seem to be borrowing the story as far as they can go from the New Testament Gospel resurrection accounts. Perrinder continues, these are not mentioned in the Quran, but they are not denied, and they agree with the common interpretation, close quote. Going further, Perrinder cites medieval Muslim authorities, Bukhari and Badawi, who note another traditional Muslim interpretation that Jesus will return someday to restore Allah's order in the world, citing Quranic texts concerning Jesus' exaltation and eschatological significance, such as Surahs 3, 4, and especially the intriguing text in 43:61. Incredibly, the English translation and commentary of the Quran, mentioned earlier at 43:61, reads, the commentary in this reads, and the second coming of Jesus will be a sign of the hour, end quote. A textual note there indicates, there's an indication that Jesus' descension before the day of judgment. That is a mention in the Muslim commentary. Perrinder is not alone in his comment that the Quranic teaching of Jesus' lack of death by crucifixion, followed by his potential return to commission his disciples in ministry and his ascension, seem to parallel the New Testament accounts of Jesus' appearances to his disciples after the crucifixion. After all, Jesus' commission of these men came after his resurrection, though before his ascension. Another Muslim specialist, Donald Rickards, contended that the meaning of Surah 4:157 is not to deny Jesus' death by crucifixion, but to assert that such did not come from human hands. In the context of Allah's sovereignty, the verse is said to point out that Jesus did die by crucifixion, but Allah's will rather than by human will. Further, Rickards points out in the Quran, Jesus or Isa predicted his own resurrection ahead of time in Surah 19, with Allah confirming that Jesus' resurrection would occur, Surahs 3, 4, and 5. Granted, Rickards' interpretation is not a normal angle on this particular Quranic text, but it's intriguing nonetheless. Moreover, texts such as Surah 19:33 that do refer to Jesus' death must also be explained. While the majority of commentators place his death in the end times, after Jesus returns, the view that it happened at the crucifixion needs to at least be considered. Further, whatever is concluded regarding Jesus' crucifixion, the issue of his resurrection and ascension are also keys here, especially given the various options among even Muslim interpreters. Oh, I have a question. I've got 26 minutes. I thought we had 40 minutes.
We have 40 minutes, but I was trying to make you leave some time for questions.
Okay, I'm going to leave 30 seconds for questions. I thought, man, these things came up fast. All right. All right.
It's because I didn't introduce you right, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Don't worry, I've shook myself up too. I don't even know where I am. All right. Whatever's concluded here regarding Jesus' crucifixion, the issue of Jesus' resurrection and ascension are also keys, given the various options among even Muslim interpreters. The point that Parender seems to be making is that several Muslim authorities include aspects that, even if Jesus did not die by crucifixion, still mimic the gospel depictions of Jesus' appearances and ascension, the latter of which is often specified. Yet another major Muslim scholar to make a similar move is Mohammed Kamil Hussein in his well-known novel, City of Wrong. After the verdict had been rendered to crucify Jesus, while Jesus waited in prison, he sent word to his disciples that he would meet them later in Galilee after 3 days. Clearly a reference to Jesus' prediction of his resurrection appears to the disciples in Mark 8, 9, 10, and 14. It appears that a number of prominent Muslim commentators, in spite of holding that Jesus never died by crucifixion, have still gone about as far as they can in affirming the gospel reports of at least Jesus' post-condemnation appearance to the disciples as well as his ascension to Allah. These are truly remarkable points of recognition. But now we come to our final, most significant critique of all. It still must be noted that the Quran presents no strictly historical grounds for rejecting the New Testament teaching of Jesus' death by crucifixion as well as his subsequent resurrection appearances. As many Muslim commentators often simply acknowledge outright, their commitment to the position that Jesus did not die by crucifixion is almost always said to be their faith in their holy book. In other words, holding their position is not due to an assertion that is based on any good evidence against Christian teachings. Rather, it is their faith in their holy book that determines their position, even though the book was written almost exactly 600 years after the crucifixion itself, and much longer if your thesis is true. But unless one exerts more or less blind commitment to their holy texts, what is there to oppose the vast amount of evidence that favors the crucifixion, for example? In evidential terms, the document written 600 years after the earliest reported data has no standing as an historical document. Strangely enough, even Didat concedes this point outright. He states, quote, "The Christian objects, how can a man, Muhammad, peace be upon him, 1,000 miles away from the scene of it happening, and 600 years after the event, pronounce as to what transpired?" The Didat's surprising and incredible answer is, the Christian's plea is valid. Their logic is good. That they don't have any good historical comeback. Didat's immediate response is to go to the Christian text to attack them. He says, well, I don't have much here. And I admit their argument's good, 600 years and a lot of miles away. But I'd rather talk about their text. Man, do they have problems. So he just kind of a switcheroo on the text while already admitting that his text doesn't make the grade historically. This is an exceptionally common move on the part of Muslim believers. If one's own text has no historical provenance whatsoever, then let's question their text. And right away, he opts to discuss contradictions in the gospel accounts, the very subject we addressed above. But we have seen that this tactic fails utterly for 3 reasons. 1, we've already noted that these claims of contradiction regarding the New Testament text can all be addressed anyway. Many scholarly volumes and literally thousands of pages have shown this in both general as well as specific cases. 2. More specifically, claim contradictions and other such problems are virtually never capable of disproving events anyway. Ask any police officer, physician, lawyer, or journalist if conflicting stories indicate that a particular accident, disease, crime, or football game never actually occurred. Highly trained professionals are experts at sorting out the most likely scenarios, even in spite of situations where the claims are far from unanimous. Remember, many if not most court cases are resolved in spite of every last component not being totally smoothed out. 3. Lastly, as pointed out above, if we use the minimal facts method, this bypasses together what are claimed contradictions and emphasizes only those facts which are exceptionally well established to the point where virtually all scholars concede them. If these established data are sufficient to establish Jesus' death and resurrection, then the case for these events is closed, whatever the additional disputed claims. Incidentally, though topics are not strictly necessary in our context, it should be noted that the Christian defense of Jesus' crucifixion is not only based on much earlier historical information, but there is also a wealth of medical data regarding the nature of death by crucifixion. As an example of this third point, Bart Ehrman is perhaps the best-known skeptical New Testament scholar today. He identifies himself as a non-Christian agnostic who leans toward atheism. As such, he states that the Gospels are unreliable works. Yet, he freely acknowledges the historicity of Jesus' crucifixion and many other facts regarding Jesus, since these events could be established without question from the data we are sure about. John Dominic Crossan says the crucifixion is probably as well established as any event in the ancient world. Thus, the evidence that everyone recognizes is plenty to proclaim, among other facts, that Jesus died by crucifixion. One more example will have to suffice here. James Crossley is another New Testament scholar who self-identifies as an agnostic unbeliever. He too rejects key portions of the gospel reports, including relevant proximate information such as the empty tomb testimony. Yet his position does not stop him from acknowledging all sorts of historical facts. We dialogued recently. The topic was, did the minimal facts support the resurrection of Jesus? He acknowledged every single one of my facts without question. And then he told the moderator, not only do I accept the facts, they're the best established facts of the New Testament. It should be clear from these examples that even when unbelieving scholars think the Gospels are untrustworthy and unreliable, this fails to preclude their arriving at the truth of many specific historical facts contained in Scripture. After all, the books in our libraries are fallible, but we utilize them regularly for good information. Therefore, even the first view of apparent contradictions and other problems does not eliminate the second position. Similarly, neither do Muslim objections to the Gospel discount our ability to determine accurate historical data. This is even more the case when, as we have said above, such claims and discrepancies can themselves be refuted on a case-by-case basis anyway. Conclusion, just one page. We will not belabor any further these Muslim objections to the proclamation of the central gospel message of the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ. In this essay, we are primarily concerned with what are probably the two most typical Muslim challenges to the truth of the Christian message. Objections to the truth of the gospel, usually in the form of claims contradictions, are not only confronted by direct refutations of each example, but these complaints fail to eliminate the specific gospel facts anyway, due to the exceptionally strong evidence for the death and resurrection of Jesus. Further, objections to Jesus' death by crucifixion also fail to hit their mark. Not only are these challenges mistaken on both historical as well as medical grounds, but using the Quran as the grounds for such objections is especially problematic. A document dated 600 years after the facts, with no direct access to the events in question, can hardly disprove a plethora of documents from shortly after the events themselves, especially when gathered from the very witnesses in question. This testimony includes both Christian as well as non-Christian sources, the testimony for the crucifixion. Although we cannot examine here the positive case for the last subject, I've done so on literally dozens of occasions, but it should be noted that I'm referring specifically to the early creedal traditions along with other evidence testimony for the death and resurrection of Jesus. Amazingly, even Bart Ehrman, Crossley, and perhaps most other critical scholars date the earliest of these materials to within a year or two of the crucifixion. Even without much elaboration and argument, it should be apparent that this basis constitutes far superior testimony to that which is derived from much, much later material. Altogether, it seems the Christian positive case for these events is much superior to the Muslim negative case against the Gospels.